My hands were elbow deep in dish soap when my brother texted me the 4 words that were supposed to destroy my life. Dad signed the papers. I set down the coffee mug I'd been scrubbing, dried my hands on the kitchen towel hanging from the oven handle, and read it again. My brother Marcus had typed it with a period at the end. Not a question mark, not an exclamation point. A period. Like it was already done, already settled, already filed away in some folder he'd been building for months. Like I was just an item on his to-do list that he'd finally crossed off. I walked to the window and looked out at my father's backyard, the vegetable garden he'd planted every spring for 30 years, the wooden bird feeder my mother had hung before she passed, the rusted porch swing we always said we'd fix, and never did. Then I walked to my car, drove to the courthouse, and filed the document I'd been holding onto for 6 weeks. By the time Marcus's congratulatory champagne had gone flat, the house already belonged to me. But you need to understand how we got there, because none of it made sense unless you knew my family. And knowing my family meant knowing that I had been the responsible one so long that everyone, including me, at times, had started to mistake that for weakness. My father's name is Gerald, and he is the kind of man who built everything he had with his own hands. He bought the house on Clearwater Drive in 1987, before I was born, and over the next 3 decades he paid off the mortgage early, kept a savings account he called his just-in-case fund, and refused to borrow money from anyone for any reason. He wasn't a rich man. He was a disciplined one. He raised 2 kids in that house, buried his wife in the cemetery 2 miles from it, and told me once, sitting on that broken porch swing, that the house wasn't just a building. It was proof that a man could start with nothing and leave something real behind. My brother Marcus is 4 years older than me. He is charming the way a used car salesman is charming, which is to say he can make you feel warm and seen right up until the moment he hands you a contract. Growing up, Marcus was the golden one, funny, athletic, easy with people in a way I never was. I was the quiet one, the studious one, the one who sat at the kitchen table doing homework while Marcus talked his way out of every consequence our father tried to enforce. Dad always caved. It was easier. I'm 31 now. I work as a paralegal at a small estate planning firm, which means I spend my days helping families organize their finances, their wills, their powers of attorney, and their end-of-life wishes. I am not a lawyer, but I know exactly how the paperwork works. I know what signatures are required and which ones can be challenged. I know what capacity means in a legal sense, and I know what happens when someone without capacity signs a document under pressure. My father had his first small stroke 14 months ago. It wasn't catastrophic. He could still walk, still talk, still tend his garden on good days. But his short-term memory had begun to slip. He'd repeat the same question twice in an hour. He'd forget that he'd already eaten lunch and start making a sandwich. His doctor called it mild cognitive impairment with vascular components. What that meant practically was that my father was still very much himself most of the time. Sharp, stubborn, proud, but he was also vulnerable in ways he didn't fully recognize yet. I'd been driving over to Clearwater Drive twice a week to help him with bills, groceries, and medication. I'd set up automatic payments on his utilities and created a shared calendar with his doctor's appointments. I asked him once, gently, whether he'd thought about updating his estate documents. He looked at me like I'd suggested something morbid and said, "I'm not dead yet, sweetheart." I let it go. I should have pushed harder. Marcus showed up about 8 months ago with a woman named Brianna. She was not a bad person, exactly. But she was the kind of person who assessed a room the moment she walked into it, who had money, who didn't, what it might eventually be worth. She worked in real estate. She had very nice highlights and a way of laughing at everything my father said that made him feel like the funniest man in the world. My father, who had been lonely since my mother died 4 years ago, absolutely loved her. Within 3 weeks, she was calling him Jerry and bringing him coffee cake on Sundays. My father, who had spent 4 years eating frozen dinners and watching baseball alone, lit up every time they walked through the door. I want to be careful here, because what I felt in those early months wasn't suspicion. It was something quieter, something more like unease that I kept pushing down because I didn't want to be the difficult one, the paranoid one, the one who couldn't just be happy that her lonely father had people around him. I told myself I was projecting. I told myself Marcus had grown up. I told myself that people could change. But I'm a paralegal, and I noticed things. The first thing I noticed was that Brianna had started asking my father questions about the house in a way that was almost too casual, like she was just making conversation. "This neighborhood's really coming up, Jerry, you know that? You could get serious money for a place like this." My father would nod, pleased. "I'm not selling," he'd say. I know, she'd say, and then change the subject. But the next visit, she'd find another way to circle back. Market value, equity. What a shame to have all that sitting there doing nothing. The second thing I noticed was that Marcus had started positioning himself as my father's primary caregiver, despite doing significantly less than I did. He started dropping by during the days when I wasn't there, taking my father to appointments, running errands. It sounds generous, but I noticed he only did it when I wasn't around, and I noticed that every visit seemed to come with some gentle commentary about my reliability. "I know Mara's busy," he'd tell my father using the nickname only he used for me, always slightly diminishing. "Don't you worry about bothering her." He was building a story where I was absent, and he was devoted, and he was telling it to the one person who might not quite remember the full record of the last 8 months. The third thing I noticed was the folder. I was in my father's study one afternoon, helping him organize some old paperwork, when I found it tucked behind his printer, a manila folder with the label Property Transfer Clearwater Drive. Inside was a draft quit-claim deed that would transfer the house into the joint names of Marcus and Brianna. There was also a one-page summary of my father's savings account, his just-in-case fund, which at that point held a little over $90,000, with a handwritten note in Brianna's handwriting that said, "Gift tax annual exclusion split over 2 years." I stood there for a long moment. The study was quiet. I took photos of every page with my phone. Then I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it, walked into the kitchen, and started making dinner like nothing had happened. But my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped a whole container of pasta on the floor and had to sweep it up. And then I stood at the kitchen counter and just breathed for a minute. My eyes closed because I needed to think. This wasn't a daydream. This wasn't Brianna idly talking about property values. There was a drafted deed. There was a plan for moving the money. Someone had sat down and done the paperwork. I couldn't tell my father. Not yet. Not without more information, and not without risking the confrontation happening before I was ready for it. I know how these things go. I've seen it at the firm families where one person raises a concern and the other side immediately accelerates everything before the concerned party can react. If Marcus knew I'd seen the folder, the timeline would compress. He'd push my father to sign something before I could do anything to stop it. And there was the harder problem, the one I had to sit with alone at night in my apartment. My father might actually want to do this. He trusted Marcus completely. He liked Brianna. He might have already mentally agreed to this plan without understanding its full implications, because his doctor had told me very clearly that one of the effects of his condition was impaired financial judgment, a reduced ability to evaluate whether a decision was in his best interest, particularly when the people around him were enthusiastic and reassuring. It wasn't that my father was incompetent. It was that he was exactly vulnerable enough to be manipulated by people he loved, and he wouldn't know it was happening. I went home that night and stayed up until 2 in the morning reading case law on undue influence and capacity challenges in property transfers. Then I called my boss the next morning, not as an employee, but as a daughter who needed advice, and asked her what I should do. She told me to act before they did. I spent the next 3 weeks moving carefully. I took my father to his neurologist and, with the doctor's help, completed a formal capacity evaluation. His doctor documented his current cognitive status, functional but impaired in specific ways, including financial decision-making. Then I sat down with my father on a Tuesday afternoon, just the two of us, and I told him I thought we should update his estate documents. No drama, no accusations. I just told him that as someone who worked in estate planning, I'd been worrying about making sure everything was organized properly, and I wanted to make sure his wishes were protected. On a good day, my father is clear-eyed and sharp. That Tuesday was a good day. He listened to me carefully. He asked questions. And when I gently explained the concept of a durable power of attorney, that it would allow a trusted person to make financial and medical decisions if he ever wasn't able to, he looked at me for a long moment and said, "Put your name on it." I typed the documents myself that evening and had them reviewed by the attorney at my firm the following morning. My father signed them 5 days later, with 2 witnesses and a notary and full documentation of his capacity at the time of signing. I filed them at the county recorder's office the same afternoon. I did not tell Marcus. Then I waited. I kept showing up on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I kept making dinner and refilling prescriptions and driving my father to his appointments. I kept noticing things the way Marcus and Brianna's visits had become more frequent, the way my father sometimes mentioned things Brianna had explained to him about the house, the way Marcus would find small reasons to criticize me when I wasn't in the room. Little things. A pattern. About 3 weeks after I filed the POA, my father mentioned to me, carefully, that Marcus had been talking to him about the house. He thinks I should simplify things, my father said, stirring his coffee. While I still can. I asked him what that meant. He said Marcus had told him it would save on estate taxes, that it was just good planning, that it was what Mom would have wanted. I smiled and said, "That sounds like something worth thinking about carefully." My father nodded. I suppose. 2 weeks later came the text. Dad signed the papers. I have thought about that moment many times since then. I think about what Marcus expected to happen. I think he expected me to call him in a panic, maybe cry, maybe threaten to contest it, and then ultimately back down the way I'd always back down. I think he expected me to be exactly what I'd always been, the responsible one who cleaned up the mess, but never actually changed the situation. Instead, I drove to the courthouse. I filed the power of attorney, along with a formal objection to the transfer on the grounds of undue influence and compromised capacity. I had the neurologist's documentation. I had the timeline showing the capacity evaluation had been completed before the signing. I had the photos of the folder in the study. I then called my father. He picked up on the second ring. In the background, I could hear Marcus's voice, celebratory and loud. "Hey, sweetheart," my father said. He sounded tired. "Did your brother call you?" "He did, Dad," I said. "Are you okay?" A pause. "I think so." Another pause. "Mara, I'm not sure I understood everything I signed today." That sentence hit me somewhere behind my sternum. I held the phone tighter. "That's okay, Dad," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'm going to take care of it. Don't sign anything else tonight, okay? Not until we talk." I did not call Marcus that night. I let the silence build. I let him and Brianna have their celebration dinner, their sense of accomplished finality. There's a strategy in that. One I learned from watching how these cases unfold at work. The party that acts first from emotion almost always makes mistakes. I was not going to act from emotion. I was going to act from documentation. I called Marcus the next morning. He answered with a confidence that I think he'd been rehearsing. "Before you say anything," he started, "Dad wanted this. He's been talking about it for months. You've been so busy, you barely even notice what's going on with him anymore." There it was, the story he'd been building. Mara is absent. Mara is distracted. Mara can't be trusted with this. "Marcus," I said, "I filed Dad's power of attorney yesterday. I also filed a formal objection to the transfer. Dad's neurologist has documented cognitive impairment affecting financial decision-making. The transfer is going to be reviewed." Silence. "You can't do that," he said. His voice had changed completely. The confidence was gone. "I already did," I said. "I'd also like to talk to you about the $90,000 in Dad's savings account. Specifically, I'd like to know if either of you has had any discussions with him about it, because the account activity from the last 6 weeks shows 4 withdrawals totaling $23,000, and none of those match any of his regular expenses." More silence, longer this time. "That money was a gift," Brianna said. She'd taken the phone from Marcus. Her voice was harder now, stripped of the warmth she used around my father. "He offered it to us. He wanted to help us." "I'm sure that's what he believes," I said. "But a gift made by someone with documented financial decision-making impairment, at the suggestion of people with a financial interest in his estate, is not legally straightforward. I have an attorney reviewing it. I want to be honest here. The conversation that followed was not civil. Marcus said things to me that I won't repeat. Brianna accused me of being jealous, of trying to control our father, of punishing Marcus for having a life and a partner while I sat alone managing everyone else's problems. At some point, Marcus got back on the phone and told me that I'd always resented him, that our father loved him more and I'd never been able to accept it, that everything I was doing was motivated by spite and not by any genuine concern for our father's welfare. It was a masterful performance of grievance, and it might have worked on me 10 years ago. What I felt instead was a kind of flat clarity, because I had been sitting at my father's kitchen table on bad days, the days when he called me by my mother's name without realizing it, when he stood in the hallway of his own house, looking lost, when he asked me what day it was, and then asked again 5 minutes later. I had been there for those days. Quietly, without documenting it for anyone, without making it into a narrative about my own devotion. And Marcus had not. "I'm not doing this because of spite," I told him, when he finally paused. "I'm doing this because Dad told me last night that he wasn't sure he understood everything he signed. And that's enough for me." I hung up. The next several weeks were genuinely hard in ways I didn't expect. My father, caught between his 2 children, grew quiet and withdrawn. He didn't fully understand what was happening legally, and I think it frightened him to realize that his signature, which had always meant something solid and final, had opened a dispute he didn't have the energy to follow. Marcus called him constantly, reassuring him, telling him I was blowing everything out of proportion. On one visit, my father looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "I don't want you two fighting over me like I'm already gone." I had to go stand in the backyard for a few minutes after that, but I also visited every Tuesday and Thursday. I kept making dinner. I refilled the prescriptions. I drove him to the neurologist, who had by now become a quiet but important witness to the whole situation. I didn't talk about Marcus during those visits. I just showed up. The formal review of the property transfer took 43 days. The county examiner found sufficient cause, given the capacity documentation and the financial history, to void the quitclaim deed on the grounds of undue influence. The $23,000 from the savings account was a more complicated matter. But my father, on a clear day, in his own handwriting, with a notary present, wrote a letter stating that he did not recall making or authorizing those withdrawals and did not consider them gifts. Marcus hired a real estate attorney. The attorney sent 2 letters, both of which my employer's attorney responded to efficiently. By the time the process was complete, there was nothing left to contest. The house remained in my father's name. The POA remained in effect. The transfer was void. I didn't win because I was smarter than Marcus. I want to be clear about that. I won because I'd been paying attention for years, and because I'd taken a single afternoon to file a piece of paper before he filed his. The day everything was finalized, I drove to Clearwater Drive and found my father in the backyard, pulling weeds from between the tomato plants, moving slowly but steadily in the late afternoon sun. He didn't hear me come through the gate. I stood there for a moment watching him, this man who had built everything with his own hands and nearly lost it to the people he trusted most, just working quietly in his garden like it was an ordinary Tuesday. He looked up when he heard the latch. "Hey, sweetheart?" He waved a dirty gloved hand. "There's iced tea in the refrigerator." I sat on the back steps. He came and sat beside me a few minutes later, pulling his gloves off. We didn't talk about Marcus. We didn't talk about the lawyers or the documents or any of it. We sat there on the back steps of the house on Clearwater Drive and drank iced tea while the evening light came through the old maple in the corner of the yard. And for a little while, it was just that. Marcus and Brianna moved to Phoenix 2 months later. I know this not because we talk we don't, not anymore, but because Brianna's real estate license transferred to an agency there, and in a town as small as ours, that kind of information gets around. My father asked about Marcus once, carefully, like someone stepping around something fragile on the floor. I told him Marcus was doing fine. That seemed to be enough. What nobody prepared me for was the part that came after the resolution. The grief, I mean. Not for what Marcus had tried to do, I'd processed that during the 43 days of legal review, alone in my apartment at night, working through every stage of it until it became just a fact about my family rather than something that still had the power to ambush me. What I grieved was the version of my brother I'd wanted him to be. The one I kept extending benefit of the doubt to, year after year. The one I kept deciding had changed, or was trying, or was just going through a hard time. I had been carrying that version of Marcus around for decades, and when I finally set it down, the relief was enormous. But relief and grief can coexist. I know that now. My father is doing okay. His bad days are more frequent than they were a year ago, which is expected, and on those days I am there. Not because I have a legal obligation, and not because I want him to see how devoted I am, just because he is my father, and he built a life in that house, and he deserves to live out his remaining years knowing that what he made is still standing. I mow his lawn on Saturday mornings. We eat lunch at the kitchen table afterward, usually sandwiches, usually with the radio on. He talks about baseball and about my mother and about the spring planting, and I listen. Sometimes he says something that lands a little sideways, a memory misplaced, a name attached to the wrong face, and I just gently redirect him without making it into a moment of loss. It's not sadness, exactly. It's just life, the real version, the one that exists after the drama is over. I think about what I would tell someone sitting where I sat 8 months ago, watching something bad start to happen and feeling like I had no power to stop it. I think I would tell them that the instinct to avoid confrontation is not a character flaw, it's a survival mechanism, and it usually served a purpose somewhere along the line. But there comes a moment when protecting the peace becomes the same thing as handing someone the keys to your father's house. And when that moment comes, you have to know the difference between starting a fight and simply refusing to lose one that was already started for you. I was never the golden child. I was never the charming one, the easy one, the one people gravitated toward at parties. I was the one who showed up on Tuesdays and Thursdays, who knew which medication went with which meal, who understood that loving someone sometimes means doing the paperwork. It turns out that was enough. It turns out it was more than enough. The house on Clearwater Drive still has the rusted porch swing we always said we'd fix. Last Saturday, after lunch, my father and I dragged it around to the back steps and oiled the hinges until it moved without squeaking. And then we sat there for a while in the late afternoon, not talking much, just watching the garden. My father looked around at the yard, the tomatoes, the bird feeder, the maple tree going gold at the edges, and said, quietly, like he was talking to himself, "I worked hard for this." "I know, Dad," I said. "It shows."